So let's talk Modern. Let's talk about all these crazy decks, these fast kills. And when I think about Modern, since the first Pro Tour in Philadelphia, the deck that won that tournament, the deck that's been winning a lot of tournaments in Modern, and I don't know if it's ever going to get banned. It doesn't seem to be the case. That's, of course, Splinter Twin. You think about Deceiver Exarch and, of course, Pestermite in combination with Splinter Twin, and at times Kiki Jiki. This is really the mainstay of Modern. You know, you can go a lot of different directions. There are just the two-color builds with blue-red. There's Teamer, there's Grixis. Sometimes there's even Jeskai with Village Bellringer. What do we think about that deck coming into this tournament?
Well, it's definitely public enemy #1. You have to be prepared for this deck if you're playing in this tournament. And part of what makes Splinter Twin so powerful, in my opinion, is its flexibility in the post-board games. There's a lot of matchups where your combo, because your opponent's playing with too much removal, maybe too many counter spells, is not something you really want to be utilizing. And so the deck can shift into a control route post-board. You already are playing cards like Cryptic Command and Snapcaster Mage, and then you can easily side into things like Batterskull or Keranos God of Storm, take the combo out of the deck entirely and become a totally different thing.
Yeah, and I think you really hit on the point. A lot of times people say, you know, well, there's this great turn 4 combo deck in Modern, this is Splinter Twin. When you think about the players who are great Twin players, they aren't the combo players. These are your Delver players. These are the people who are going to play something like Splinter Twin. So you talked about blue-red, that's the thing that won the first Pro Tour in Modern. Samuel Estradi played it. But I actually think we're going to see more of the 3-color builds this weekend. So whether it's Teamer Twin, which plays Tarmogoyf, you know, we've seen that do very well at the Pro Tour stage, or the most recent one, which is Grixis Twin, which really goes on Tasigur, and most importantly, Kolaghan's Command. I'm expecting to see those as the big contenders this weekend.
Go ahead.
Well, it's very interesting. A lot of the cards you alluded to that people are going to for a third color are cards like Tarmogoyf. They're cards like Tasigur. It's not necessarily cards for the combo. It's cards in some part to help the deck get away from the combo and some of those post-board situations when you're playing against Abrupt Decay decks, you're playing against Path to Exile decks, and trying to put Splinter Twin on a creature is very challenging to do.
Now, you talk about Tarmogoyf and you talk about Kolaghan's Command, and there actually happens to be a deck that really plays those two cards very well together. It's really the deck that, coming in this tournament, a lot of people are talking about it. It's very obviously Jund. No matter how many times they try to ban cards from this deck, be it Deathrite Shaman, be it Bloodbraid Elf, it's still hanging around. Jerry Thompson's been working really hard on this deck, as is Brad Nelson, a lot of the guys in the Roanoke area. Now, Matthias, you don't strike me, excuse me, as much of a Jund guy, but in Standard, you don't really strike me as much of a Siege Rhino guy, and you've kind of made the switch there. Kolaghan's Command is a very, very powerful card. Thoughtseize, Liliana of the Veil, Dark Confidant, these are all insanely powerful cards in one shell. I don't know if, you don't strike me as the type to play Jund, but, you know, when you're playing your combo decks, you know, you have to know that Jund is something you have to beat. So how do you approach it from maybe your standpoint of combo, and not really a deck that you would want to play, but know you have to beat during the tournament?
Well, what you have to know is that what the Jund decks do, and especially from any point of view, is that there are a lot of decks that can start with Inquisition of Kozilek, Thoughtseize, Dark Confidant, and Liliana of the Veil. These are all black cards, and that is certainly one way to attack the combo and more unfair aspect of the format. So when you're looking at, you know, like a combo deck, that's really what you care about. Now, the question you mentioned, Jund, Junk, Abzan, what is it that you actually want to play next to these cards? And now most people are going to be playing green for things like Tarmogoyf and Abrupt Decay because he fits really well into that shell. Where I think it's interesting is where we'll see these variations is what people think the fair decks of the format will be. So the Abzan decks get to play things like perhaps Siege Rhino, perhaps Lingering Souls, perhaps Path to Exile, whereas I think we're going to see more Jund this weekend. And I mentioned this before with Twin. Kolaghan's Command is a really popular card this weekend because it's just this, it's very main deckable and it's got great answers to artifact hate as well as just being able to make people discard if they're a combo deck. So I think we'll see more Jund, but either way, it's these black-green decks that you'll expect to be a big part of the meta.
You agree? I mean, black-green seems really big coming in.
Definitely, and all the decks that you just alluded to, in my opinion, are kind of the same thing. They're 3-color good stuff decks suited to taste based on what threats and what answers you want for a particular weekend. I know with Abzan versus Jund, for example, a lot of players distill it just to Lightning Bolt versus Path to Exile. That's the decision you're ultimately making. If you're expecting a lot of decks like Twin, for example, where Lightning Bolt isn't necessarily a reliable removal spell against the combo, maybe you want to be playing Path to Exile. If you're expecting a lot more cheap creatures, Lightning Bolt may be the superior card. Lingering Souls is really good against Mendelian Click and certain Planeswalkers. It's poor if the metagame's fast with a lot of combo decks. So what decision players ultimately make is going to be predicated on what cards they're anticipating their opponents having, what decks they expect to show up, because at their essence, these are the same decks. They're black, green, X, quality of threats, quality removal, quality discard decks.
Going to be very popular. I know a lot of big name players in this particular tournament are really siding towards that strategy. Not to say that we're not going to see a lot of Twin, because I believe we will, but that kind of fairer Abrupt Decay, Thoughtseize, Dark Confidant, fairer, because those cards are fairer. in Modern. I think we're going to see a lot of those. Now, we're going to work our way towards some of the more unfair decks in just a moment, but let's talk about Delver's Secrets, which is a fair card as well. Another deck that can play Kolaghan's Command. A lot of Grixis Delver talk coming into this particular weekend. How do we like the Delver decks? Because, you know, you think about Delver decks in Legacy, you got Brainstorm, you have Ponder, you have Preordain if you want it, Gitaxian Probe. Here you have Serum Visions, which is, not great, but you got to play it.
Not as good. Certainly not as good as Brainstorm or Ponder.
Yeah.
But it's a necessary evil. You just need more spells in the deck. And honestly, you know, when you're playing with cards like Tassiger and other Delve cards, it's not too bad to be playing with cheap cantrips, almost no matter what the upside is. So no, it's not as souped up as it is in Modern, in Legacy rather, but that's probably for the best. I think this deck, Grixis Delver and the other Delver variants, very solid against the combo decks of the format. You have a clock plus counter spells that's typically going to be very good against combo decks. Where I would be concerned is how much Jund is in the room, how much Abzan is in the room. I don't think this deck is particularly good at playing against quality threats plus quality removal, and I'm worried that there's just going to be a lot of those decks in the room this weekend between Jund and Abzan.
You're a combo guy. Do you get scared of Delver decks in this format?
To a point, I mean, I think the Delver decks are scary. A lot of times they're actually occupying the same spot in the metagame that Twin is. We talked about how a lot of the Twin players don't play the Twin combo, and I think we actually see players, you know, build that same shell, your Snapcasters, Serum Visions, and then just get rid of the Twin combo entirely to play more quality cards. Sometimes, actually, as a combo player, what I actually sometimes am worried about is what we see players like Jeff Hoagland do, where he takes something like a Teamer Twin deck, takes out the entire Twin combo, and then runs Blood Moons and a land disruption package instead.
Yep.
When you look at some of your less fair decks in the format, and I think we'll get to those in a second, a lot of them really rely on their lands. So in a certain sense, I think that's where I want the Delver decks to be right now.
Speaking of lands, there's a deck that plays a lot of them, and a lot of singletons of them. One that you're very, very familiar with, and one that is also, it seems pretty popular. Chris Van Meter has been writing a lot about Amulet Bloom, Sam Black as well, and it's tough because this deck is very, very complicated to play. There's a lot going on, and in essence, you're not even playing Magic. It's like you're kind of peeling the layers back on a puzzle. Now, I know at a Pro Tour you started very, very well with that strategy, expecting not to have to play against a lot of Thoughtseizes, and hoping not to have to play against a lot of Blood Moons, which you did run into over the course of the tournament, which is lights out against Amulet Bloom. However, as we saw at Pro Tour Fate Reforged when Justin Cohen got second place, this deck is obscenely powerful, especially if you know how to harness the power. So coming into this tournament, what are your expectations for Amulet Bloom, Matthias?
I think Amulet Bloom is a tier 1 deck right now. You know, it's gotten a board plan where the Thoughtseize issue is really not as big as it used to be. Now, Twin still beats it, so you still have some bad matchups in the room. But where I think it'll be kept in check is that, as you mentioned, the deck's really unorthodox. So if you want to play this deck, I mean, you have to, you know, you don't really get good at it until your 100th match or so. So for players who only play Modern, like our open competitors, you know, there's been one open so far, who play it very infrequently, this is a really hard deck to just pick up and play. That said, I'm really excited that Chris Van Meter has done that. Definitely going to be on Team CVM this weekend.
He's put in a lot of games. He's written around a lot about it. He's streamed with it. He's played IQs with it to good finishes, but it is not a deck that you can pick up and play. That's not something you can possibly do. Does that maybe dissuade people from playing it, or maybe people should be staying away from it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've talked to people who have considered playing the deck for the tournament and just simply feel like they don't have enough reps in. To me, I agree with Matthias. This deck has all the hallmarks of being a tier 1 combo deck. You have a lot of matchups where your opponent just doesn't have play against what you're doing because your mode of interaction is so unorthodox.
Yep.
And then you have a percentage of draws that are so good that you overpower even your bad matchups.
Yep.
That's usually to me the signal of a very good combo deck. And then post-board, in the matchups where people are trying to grind you down, they're trying to attack your lands, well then you can switch to things like Thragtusk and other quality threats, get a little bit away from the land element of your combo deck, and then become kind of your own ramp Jund style deck of your own. It's a very
weird deck.
Yeah, it's a very flexible way of sideboarding. I don't know how much we're going to see of this deck because it's very complicated to play. It's not very forgiving of mistakes, but I agree with Matthias, absolutely a tier 1 deck.
The last deck we'll talk about here in the Modern section, and there are so many decks, we could talk about Modern for hours on end, trust me, but we're going to throw you a bone here and talk about Burn very quickly, mostly because it had a really, really good performance at Pro Tour Fate Reforged, and I know coming into this tournament, it's something that people are preparing for. There are a lot of different ways you can go about beating Burn, Core Firewalker, Leyline Sanctity, all of that good stuff, but this is probably the best Burn deck we have seen in Modern, as far as like it can kind of stand up to some things. You've got really good cards in Skullcrack and Goblin Guide and Monastery of Swiftspear, so the options are certainly there if you want to splash a Tarkus command, you have Fetch Lance to kind of facilitate that. How do we feel about that deck, especially going into the tournament where it's this thing now where at Pro Tour Fate Reforged was like, I don't think anyone's going to play Burn, but now it's like, okay, this is a reasonable choice to play.
Definitely. And I think that where it's gotten harder for the rest of the room playing against a deck like Burn is you can no longer go to one card in your sideboard and completely hose the deck.
Sure.
Because of the printing of Destructive Revelry. Before, you could just say, all right, I've got Leyline of Sanctity, I've got some other artifact or enchantment they can't really interact with, and that's going to lock them out of the game. That's no longer the case. And with the white splash in the deck, even cards like Core Firewalker aren't necessarily reliable because of Path to Exile. Pyrite Spellbomb's always an option. So typically, Burn has had a lot of very good game ones against the field, and then post-board, well, you're playing against a bunch of Spell Skites and white ley lines, and that's how you lose a lot of your matches. Because of Destructive Revelry, that's no longer the case. I think this deck's, again, very, very good. To me, the big question is what's going on the fringes of the room. It's not about white ley line to me. It's not necessarily about Spellskite, because you have answers to that. It's, are the Jund decks playing with enough Scavenging Oozes? Are people playing with Inquisition of Kozilek instead of Thoughtseize? What are people's mana bases like? Are they sacrificing some Ravnica dual lands, maybe to get more lands like Copperline Gorge into their deck and take less damage? When people are making those kind of decisions, every time you do something like that, your percentage against Burn just goes up a little bit, up a little bit, up a little bit, until you finally have a good matchup. To me, that's really going to define Burn's performance in this tournament. It's less about the horrible sideboard cards, because you have answers to those now. It's more about what are the 58th, 59th, 60th card people have in their main deck.
Expectations of Burn for this tournament for you?
Yeah, and I think I like what you said about what are those last cards. And for me, it's also just the metagame. You know, what are the off decks that people are playing? I think if it's a room where lots of people are trying to play Kolaghan's commands, planning to play 3-color control decks, I start to like Burn. The more you see people get to linear combo decks, even your less tier 1 decks, I mean, if you get the more card decks like Affinity that are in the room, the less I start to like Burn, because those matchups can be harder for it. But yeah, Burn's a tier 1 deck, and especially the greedier and the more fair Magic people start trying to play, the more I really like casting Lava Spikes.
Well, there are a lot of options, obviously, in this format. We didn't even really talk about Affinity. We talked more about the card that's kind of pushing Affinity out of the format and Kolaghan's command. So wouldn't surprise any of us here in the booth to see that deck do well, or a bevy of other decks do well in Modern, because really, honestly, there are like 20 different decks that people can play. That said, there's another half of this tournament, which means we have another format to discuss. And even though we might see a little bit of Siege Rhino in Modern, we're going to see a lot of it as we discuss Standard.